Hi, I'm Kathryn, and welcome back to our series on home espresso. In this video, we will be talking about the role of coffee in espresso. So let me just open up with one important thing. There are no unique espresso beans. If something is labeled as an espresso bean, they're probably a little misguided. Espresso is a brew method. It's something you make out of coffee beans, or it's the brewed coffee. It has nothing to do with the coffee, or the cherry, or the tree. Occasionally, a roaster might specify something as an espresso roast because they roasted it a little darker in an intent to try to make it easier to make espresso. But this is still a little bit of a misnomer because, again, espresso is a brew method, and if you saw something labeled as like a V60 roast, you'd probably raise an eye. And espresso is kind of the same way. This begs the question, though, why do people think espresso roasts or even espresso beans are unique things? And the answer to that is complicated. Firstly, you have the history, the tradition of Italian coffees. Italy is the birthplace of espresso, we all know that. There have been various leaps throughout the years on how exactly these espresso machines work, but Italy is the birthplace of that pressurized, small, strong coffee, and so they established a lot of the procedures. And Italians have typically preferred Robusta beans and darker roasted coffee. Robusta is robust, it is a hardy plant, so it was a lot cheaper and it's easier to access for a lot of history. In fact, the entire focus on Arabica coffee is actually relatively recent in the history of coffee, only really appearing with the second wave. But Robusta has more caffeine and, importantly for the purpose of espresso, creates a thicker, more stable crema. And crema is really important in the presentation of espresso, and presentation is really important in most Italian coffees. Dark roasts also create more crema due to the extra carbon dioxide that's able to build up within the bean during the roast process, but we'll come back to more on dark roast in just a minute. One other thing about Robusta, during the espresso boom post-World War II, Italy was pretty poor, so they had to buy cheaper coffees, oftentimes Robustas, and other coffees that ended up being low acidity, low cost, because they were not very wealthy. And they were a lot of blends, just kind of whatever they could pay for. Roasting these types of coffees darker tends to get them to taste more consistent. When you go really dark with a roast, you kind of blur out all of the origin characteristics. And so swapping out a coffee in your blend is a little easier when you just go really dark. And so Italian roasts are traditionally extremely dark roasts. That's part of how that long-time tradition was born. Pair all of this together, and you might be able to see why some people might assume that a very dark roast coffee is an espresso roast or even an espresso bean. Now, there are a couple more reasons why one might choose a darker roast for espresso, so it's time for a little bit of science. Dark roasts are more soluble than medium or lighter roasts. Since espresso is such a short brew method, lasting only 18 to 20 to up to about 40 seconds, that solubility can be very noticeable. People tend to see lighter roast espressos as very sour. That's not because light roasts do anything different as an espresso. It's because lightly roasted beans are less soluble. So if you follow all the same steps that get you a good balanced espresso, if you have a grind and a temperature and a dose that all work really well for a medium or a dark roast, when you put a light roast in there, it's not able to extract as much. Remember, acids dissolve first, so all that the light roast has time to get to in those settings are those acids, and none of the sweet sugary goodness. A lot of light roast espresso is sour because it's under extracted. There are a couple of other factors that affect solubility as well. Higher altitude grown coffees tend to become more dense, which decreases solubility. As a little bit of an aside, lower altitude grown coffees tend to be the hardier and the cheaper coffees. They don't have to be, but they usually are, and that is because higher altitudes prevent pests and crop diseases more. So a lot of farms with various elevations, they'll put their expensive or their more delicate crops up higher in the elevations, the ones they really don't want to lose, and they'll keep their hardier or their cheaper crops at a lower elevation. Lower elevation does not mean cheap coffees, but cheap coffees will almost always be grown at a lower elevation. And on top of that, lower elevation grown beans tend to be less acidic because the beans develop a little more quickly. So remember how Italy wasn't a super wealthy country when espresso started exploding. They had to get cheaper coffees, which meant lower elevation coffees, which meant more soluble, less acidic. All those things line up to espresso in Italy was always a very soluble coffee and always a very low acidity coffee. Another factor in why dark roast is so often used for espressos, lattes, cappuccinos, milk. If you aren't going to have amazing espresso, bitter coffee flavors are a little bit more easily muted with milk and with sugar than your really pungent sour flavors. And even if it is a really great espresso, the types of flavors that dark roasts bring out, nuttiness, chocolatiness, those go really nicely with milk, and bright coffee flavors are often either a little jarring with milk or just get lost. When you taste acidic flavors in your milk, you probably assume that the milk is sour. We don't want that. And if the espresso is too acidic, it can even curdle the milk. This isn't super common. It requires coffee to be pretty darn acidic, but there is the possibility that that can happen. And from there, if the expectation is just going to be that the coffee is covered up with lots of milk and lots of sugar, why try to buy unique, high-quality beans? Why roast light to keep these origin fruity notes if you won't even taste them? Why not blend together whatever beans you can get your hands on and roast them really dark so they aren't distinguishable from one another? Sounds a lot like what was necessarily the case early on in espresso's early history, right? Dark roasts will taste more consistently like one another because you've caramelized most of the sugars, you've broken down a lot of the organic compounds that give one coffee a unique taste. So there are a lot of reasons that bigger shops will use darker roasts. Some of those reasons might also apply to you. So, what coffee should you use for your espresso? And the answer to that is almost as complicated as the answer to how do I make good espresso. There are a lot of factors that might influence exactly what bean you want for espresso. I think the first question to ask is, how are you going to be drinking your espresso? Espresso allows such a wide variety of drinks that depending on what you're going to be preparing, you might want a different bean. Are you going to be making mostly desserts, affogatos, or blended drinks, or mochas? If that's the case, then I'd honestly suggest something that's easier to extract and maybe even blended to bring out a smooth, balanced flavor. A medium or a darker roast that's super easy to extract the sugars from are gonna go much better in your dessert. Don't go for a really bright, fruity coffee if you're in it for the sweets. You just wanna have an easy time extracting, and you just want coffee that won't add any odd flavors to your desserts. Are you going to be drinking it primarily black? Shots, Americanos? Well, now you probably want to think about what you like in your coffee. We do have a whole class on how to taste coffee, so if you want to dig deeper into developing your palate and choosing a coffee that you know you'll love, I recommend checking out that class. But I'll cover some other things that you can look at quickly when reading a coffee bag to try to buy and pick something for espresso. A big one to look at in the info on a bag of coffee is to look for flavor notes on it. Do you know if you like caramel, cocoa sort of coffee notes? Or earthy, smoky, woodsy flavors? Maybe you love fruit-forward flavor notes. Keep in mind, these are nuanced flavors. Some of them might be more relating to the body or the mouthfeel. Cream as a flavor note on a bag might mean the coffee makes a very smooth and creamy feeling coffee. The origin plays a large role in those flavor notes. Obviously, countries are huge, and even just from farm to farm, you'll have some differences in the geological, in the development of the coffee, but there's a good chance that coffees from nearby farms and regions do have similar soils, similar other types of plants growing, and similar overall flavor profiles. Another thing to look at for flavor information is the process. A dry process or a natural process will tend to taste a little more fruity and tend to be a little more acidic regardless of the origin. And a washed process will really taste like what that terroir is. So if you know you pretty much always love Colombian coffees, but don't know why, I'd look for a washed coffee from that origin. Honey process is sort of in the middle of those two. And then there are all kinds of experimental processes that can do a lot to the coffee as well. Fermented processes will be fruity and even more acidic. There's all kinds of processes out there now. There's also the varietal. But with a few notable exceptions, I would actually say that varietal won't play as much of a role in the flavor as the origin and the process. For example, a geisha from Colombia tastes very different from a geisha from Panama, and different still from a geisha from Ethiopia. It will always be a more delicate, a more floral sort of flavor, but it will still reflect the terroir a lot. So if you're primarily drinking black coffee, espresso or Americanos, like I said, then you want to pick a coffee you love as a coffee. Keeping in mind that if you do get a really bright, fruit-forward Ethiopian, you'll have to do some extra work on how to get a great shot. Which brings us to the question of, what are the limitations of your machine or of your grinder? Can you adjust very much about it? Do you have pre-infusion so you can go really, really fine? Or do you have a pressurized portafilter on a super auto machine? If you can't adjust very much on your espresso machine, you might not want to pick a really fruity, really light coffee, even if that is the type of coffee you love to drink black. You probably won't be able to get a very good shot out of it. Remember, dark roasts are a lot easier to extract and light roasts are a lot harder to extract. So this won't answer your question, but it does give you something to think about, and it might cut out some of the options on the table. So if you picked out a coffee, if you have a dark roast or a medium roast, you probably have a lot of good information to go get started on your home espresso game. If you've picked a light roast coffee, well, the next lesson will get into some of what you really want to keep in mind when you're trying to take this and make really good espresso out of it. You can find a link to that next video in the bio, and if you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe. You can also find other coffee classes at sagebrushcoffee.com. Thanks again for watching. I'm Kathryn, and I hope that you have a great day.